What I want to do today is to talk about an application that we've done at PwC called the Experience Navigator. And we use AnyLogic and dynamic modeling at PwC in the analytics practice. That's a very growing thing in business right now. Everybody's talking about analytics, and PwC is actively trying to grow that practice. And we use AnyLogic in simulation a lot. In areas like supply chain, financial services, insurance, across the board. What I want to talk a little bit today about is an application to marketing problems. So this is going to be a little different. And what I'm going to do is to argue that agent-based modeling is a good alternative to traditional marketing mix type models that a lot of you have probably seen out in industry. And for some kinds of products and some kinds of situations, I think there are some tremendous advantages to agent-based modeling and also agent-based modeling mixed with system dynamics. The slide up there right now talks about how the aggregate of individual rational behavior can often lead to something that's unpredictable. Other people have talked about the properties of emergence. And emergence is something that is incredibly important in all kinds of market dynamics. And I'm going to give you a case study of a policy change at an airline where emergence essentially became most of the story. But marketing models need to have the capability of showing emergence under a lot of cases because it makes a big difference. Just a quick word on traditional marketing mix models. Marketing mix models, and I can't characterize them all in just a couple of generalities, but generally speaking, what you'll see with marketing models these days, and these are done by major market research companies and advertising agencies, is you end up with a dependent variable in a regression equation with various variables like prices, advertising, distribution, and some other things on the right-hand side of the equation. And these models are then used to either predict sales or in some cases to try to search out optimal levels of price and advertising spending. Very, very common out there. It's become a multi-billion-dollar industry. These models, we believe, are extremely limited and have problems that make them inappropriate for many different kinds of applications. For one thing, they are aggregate. Often, all customers are represented in a single regression equation, which completely ignores the heterogeneity of consumers, which is critical. Not all consumers behave the same way. A second property is there's no interaction between consumers. And here we get to emergence. Emergent behavior in markets often comes from the interaction between consumers as they share attitudes and stories and memories. The market can often behave more as a whole, as a single organism, than as a collection of individuals. Traditional marketing models don't include this at all. There's no explicit representation of the process of consumer decision making. You don't see consumers gathering information, making choices, forming consideration sets, as they do in the real world in these models. There's no concept of a consumer's memory or history. Nonlinear relationships are not accounted for. And by accounted for, I mean they're not taken into account in the behavior of the model. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If you take these traditional regression models and let's say you cut marketing spending for a period of a year, marketing sales will go down as you would expect them to do. But when you put marketing spending back up, in these models, sales returns to the same level that it did before. Okay? There's no concept of hysteresis or path dependence, which is actually demonstrably found in a lot of different kinds of markets. The data is often limited to simply time series data. There's a lot of other kinds of information we would like to take into account, and they have relatively short time horizons. This makes these models inappropriate for a lot of different kinds of problems. In the Experience Navigator platform, this is a set of what I would call design tools that we've developed at PwC. What these are is a set of techniques or tools for representing the way that consumers make choices in markets, the timing of decisions, the substance of decisions, how consumer experience will interact with different characteristics of the product, etc. It's a set of design tools or sets of equations that are represented in AnyLogic. You can think about them almost as being a library that we can use to represent different kinds of market situations. And what I'd like to do is to take you through a particular problem that we worked on applying the tools of the Navigator to the problem that an airline faced. This is an airline that you all will know. I'm not going to give you the name because I'm not supposed to, but you can make your own guesses. As you all know, everybody who flew here today very likely paid some obnoxious fees on the part of the airline. They have just started charging for everything. Plausible legroom now costs you an additional X%. It's incredible. So this airline, though, had resisted the temptation to charge for a variety of different kinds of services that the airline provided. They did not charge the fees that their competitors had fairly recently began to charge. They were under intense pressure from Wall Street and various analysts to change their policies and say, we're going to charge for this. And if you simply did the static multiplication problem and multiplied the amount of fees per customer times the number of customers they had in their flights, you would come up with a number that over several years would be in the billions of dollars that would make an appreciable impact on the stock price. They were trying to determine, is this a good idea or not? On the one hand, there's the obvious increase in fees that you might get. But on the other hand, there are longer-term potential impacts on brand equity, market shares, customer loyalty, and the like, which are more difficult to quantify, but everybody in the organization knew that they were potentially important. So who are you going to call? Well, you call your friendly-based, agent-based modeler. And I actually was a consultant to the consultants on this project. The people who actually did the work, let me name them, John Glick, Nick Eng, and Scott Fullman. Scott, you're back there someplace. If you want to put up your hand, there's Scott. He's one of the people who is responsible for doing much of the good work on this. And we decided to do an agent-based model of several of the airline's major markets. So for example, we would do the Chicago market, the New York market. We looked at individual markets. And to construct an agent-based model of consumer decision-making. That model consisted of several sectors: the client, the competition. It included a process of consumers making choices about what flights to purchase, and essentially a fairly complete representation of the ecosystem for that particular airline that the airline found itself in a particular set of markets. And what we wanted to try to do would be to understand how the interaction of these different factors might produce behavior in terms of revenue and market share and overall profitability over time. We're going to take a look at the decision process that consumers go through in order to determine a booking in some detail. This is a stylized representation of a state chart, and there is such a state chart, almost identical, in the AnyLogic software. We created a representative sample of consumers. They were endowed with the characteristics that consumers had. There were about the correct number of business travelers, casual travelers, etc. Those people traveled with a certain frequency Up here, you can see at the very top of the chart that there are some people who are out of the market. They are inactive, they're not looking for a flight, but periodically they would decide to become active and they would search for flights. Once they would hit that state, they would hit another state in the process, and that would be the process of going through and trying to book a flight. Here's where the guts of the model, I think, really begin to be realized. It's a representation of the consumer choice process that we believed characterized people's decision-making in terms of what airline that they would buy. And there are a number of factors that would go into that choice process. One would be what we would call the fare utility, the value proposition for the airline. These would be various product features such as availability of the flight. Did they have a flight when you wanted to go? How comfortable it is, convenience, and price. I'm going to say some more about this later, but this part of the model was informed by an extensive market research study that PwC does called the Knowledge Radar. And that study involves a large-scale conjoint analysis or discrete choice model that attempts to quantify the weights that consumers put on different kinds of product attributes. That kind of a study plus market research that the client did that was similar is what quantifies the utility part of this. A point I want to make is that agent-based models can often be an important tool for data fusion in the sense that they allow you to pull together data from all kinds of other sources that might not normally be integrated. In this case, it would be market research data about consumer choice. A critical factor, though, in this particular model was consumer experience, loyalty, and word of mouth. And of course, all of these go together. Consumers in this model, when they did the flight or they got new information about this airline, would update their perceptions. Essentially, memories would be created about their experience with this particular airline. Literally, in the model, there is an active object called a memory, which can have a life and set of dynamics of its own. Those memories can be shared between consumers, and they influence decision-making. In addition, loyalty is impacted by, have you flown this airline recently, and your cumulative experience with the airline. And then, to the point of emergence, word of mouth becomes critical. These consumers communicate with each other. And for this particular airline, the interaction between consumers is absolutely critical here. Once a consumer has an experience with this airline, it's very quickly communicated through chat rooms, Twitter, various kinds of social networking platforms. So the communication is very quick, and people have a high degree of emotional involvement with the airline. And so decision-making here, consumer decision-making here about what airline to fly is the result of personal preferences in terms of individual utility, but also experiences the individual has had and experiences that the individuals had that are shared with other people. So other people's experiences become your experiences through word-of-mouth communication. And so the model has a very rich set of interactions which create the possibility here for emergence. To say a little bit more about this, we talked about the direct changes here, and one of the things here that we simulated was the direct impact of some of these changes. Direct impacts would be, for example, what happens if you change the product, you're changing the price, you're now charging for things. There's a direct impact here along the lines of a price elasticity of demand. But there were also what I would call perception shocks. people had expectations about how this airline would behave and what they would charge for and what the airline actually stood for in a value sense. Those things could be shocked by changes in policies, and that was represented as well. And then ongoing changes in consumer experience. Various indirect impacts would be things like word of mouth and loyalty. Now, you can see various feedbacks again occurring here. The model has a rich feedback structure and looks at the set of interactions. And also a rich set of side effects, products and policies have these kinds of indirect effects on word of mouth and loyalty. Okay, so what kinds of data sources could you possibly use to calibrate a model like this? How do you go about trying to put data to something like this? And what I would want to leave you with is that it's really a process of data fusion, looking at a wide variety of different kinds of data. I'm going to start with the bottom here in terms of qualitative knowledge of the airline industry. And here my background for a long time in system dynamics is really going to show up. System dynamics was created by a guy by the name of Jay Forrester back in the late 1950s. I had the privilege of working for Jay at one point. And Jay used to say that only a small fraction of the data that we actually use, a small fraction of the relevant data, is actually in numeric form. A lot of it is just in terms of what people know about the structure of a business, what they know about what is connected to what. And qualitative knowledge of the airline industry here is absolutely critical. In terms of using information that the client has, experience that PwC experts have in how people make choices of airlines, how competitors interact, the basic set of interactions that are important. So that first and foremost is the kind of information that you use in order to set the structure of the model. Once we get past structure, though, we get to the point of needing to calibrate, and there's a variety of different kinds of information sources that you can use. One would be time series. So just like the marketing mix models do, we can use any available time series data about airline market shares, volumes, and prices. Sometimes that data in these marketing models can be used to make direct parameter estimates. So for example, this isn't the airline case, but in other cases I've had, for example, in the automobile industry, data on car sales and car ownership could be used to calibrate directly how long people held a car, the average life of a car. Those would be direct estimates. In other cases, you can use time series and time series data to estimate unknown parameters. And that is used here as well. Nate Osgood, who is here, is doing some pioneering work in using Bayesian techniques to estimate model parameters. It's possible to use things like weighted least squares as well, a variety of different kinds of techniques. And what I can say is we use all of them. Okay, we've used all of them. A second thing would be a cross-section of individual travel behavior. For example, this model includes an extensive sector about how frequently people fly. Okay, so, how frequently different kinds of people fly. It also includes cross-sections about the weights that people put on different attributes. This comes from the market research study. I mentioned to you the PwC Experience Radar, which is a large-scale market research study that can be used to calibrate these. Often what you'll find is that the client has a variety of market research studies, discrete choice models, but also other kinds of models about how consumers make decisions. And these can all be integrated, as well as information from the consumer choice literature. So there's a variety of different kinds of information sources. One kind that I want to comment on that I think is especially interesting here, and that is I mentioned that there's extensive work in this model about how consumers share memories and share ideas and concepts between each other, the word-of-mouth communication. And one of the things that Scott Fullman and the team did was actually to look at sentiment analysis scores communicated over the web via things like Twitter and Facebook. You can actually get this data, you can buy it, and people calculate sentiment analysis scores. And what they did was, I think, really interesting. This company before had made some changes in terms of their frequent flyer program. They had changed their frequent flyer program from time to time. And you could actually go back and look and see how consumer sentiment, as described from web data, changed when they made those kinds of decisions. So you could see if they made an adverse change, they made it harder to get a free ticket. You could actually see that show up in the sentiment analysis. This provided us with a way to calibrate how consumer sentiment might change if you made some kind of a policy change. I think this is a real frontier. I think it's possible to do even a lot more than this, with this kind of information than what we've had. And PwC is actively pursuing sources of data about social networks and customer sentiment, and we're looking very hard at how to go about integrating those things into this type of model. So, what happened finally? Well, let me tell you the remainder of the story. So I told you before that Wall Street put the company, the airline, under intense pressure to make the change. The model result was kind of interesting. What the model results showed, and this was quite a robust result for a lot of variations in the parameters, was that the losses in market share revenue over the long term, several year period of time, would be so large as to significantly offset any gains that you would get from the fees. To put it another way, if you did a test where you assumed that this company simply set the fees at parity with where the competitors had set them, had done the same things that consumers didn't like that their competitors had done, their loss of market share would be considerably greater than what the competition had, because so much of the choice behavior for this particular airline depended upon positive brand equity and positive perceptions. So actually, in this particular case, at least so far, they have followed the advice and have seen significant gains actually in market share. So I think I consider this one to be a success story. And at least for some people, it was a counterintuitive result, not to everybody, but it allowed us to quantify a result that really was not quantifiable before.